Good morning, everybody. This is what you would call a busy news day. A new government in the UK, a $5 billion settlement with Facebook, a rewriting of the relationship between the White House and Capitol Hill on its relationships in the Middle East, and it's hot. So there's no doubt at all that if you've worked in the news before, you will know that the biggest story of all is that it's hot. And so I should start by saying to you, thank you all very much, because we know both how significant and important the weather is, and the fact that you got up early on a warm day to be here, I enormously appreciate. When I started out as a journalist, there's a great story about a cub reporter who goes to cover a wedding. And the cub reporter comes back and the editor says, you know, what did you make of the story? And the reporter says, well, there wasn't really a story because the bride didn't show up. I appreciate that there is a slight danger that people might feel that we are here discussing the future of tech regulation and the financial system while our whole culture of government is being turned on its head. We will have, at 9 o'clock this morning, inside Tortoise for Tortoise editors, a sort of planning meeting on editorial story commissioning around the new government in the UK. We'll hold it in the green room at the back, and we'll start it promptly after we finish this at 9. Anyone who's here who, A, wants to weigh in because they've got things to say, or simply happens to know some extremely salacious details of members of the new cabinet, all of you are welcome to come and join us and weigh in on our thinking on how we spend the next few months working on covering the Boris Johnson government. The final thing I should say is we did, of course, invite Facebook to join us formally. I'll be generous and say they've been inundated by such offers. And so, unfortunately, we're not able to join us. So part of my job as editor today will be to try to make sure that the Facebook point of view is in the room. But I'm going to start, if I might, by coming to you, Elizabeth, and just get stuck straight in. I'll ask everyone to introduce themselves, but it's unfair on Elizabeth not to make this point. Elizabeth Linder, amongst her many other achievements, helped build the politics and government business at Facebook in Europe and the Middle East and Africa. So when you look at it, Elizabeth, what do you think is the case for Facebook, and how should it approach the growing government anxiety about the introduction of Libra?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I should mention that I spent 8 years as a Facebook spokesperson. I'm no longer a Facebook spokesperson, but as someone who's been inside the machine, I can certainly imagine, and I go back often, what it is that went into this decision. First of all, I find it incredibly annoying that one of the key characteristics of the coverage around the introduction of Facebook Libra has been, why now? If anybody in this room has had any experience with entrepreneurship, that's the wrong question. When the time is right for innovation, you go for it. You don't wait for permission. You don't ask questions. Somebody else is going to get into this space if it's not Facebook. And so I can speak as a native Californian who's lived here for 9 years, that one of the biggest disconnects I've seen between the way that Europeans tend to approach innovation and the way that Californians approach innovation is Europeans ensure that they're comfortable with how it is that innovation is going to land before going for it, on average. Californians say, look, we know we're going to get in a ton of trouble, but we should just go for it because we're going to get ahead faster. And that's just the sheer reality of the situation. Now, I've seen a lot at Facebook and a lot of bad decisions along the way. I get that. But I also find that entire strand of coverage goes so against the California ethos. The second brief point that I would make on all of this is, you know, the whole financial sector was so ripe for disruption. If anybody in this room has lived and worked abroad, you know, sending just $5 to your grandma is incredibly annoying across different platforms. And for all of the studies that come out that show, you know, oh, well, people trust this. You know what? If it works, people will use it. And we've seen that over and over and over again. You know, Uber, for all of the frustrations and the ethical questions and this and that, when you're in a tight space and you don't trust the taxis and you're worried about how to get around, you know, globally, you hop in Uber, you know how it works, it's a great technology. And I think something similar applies here, that for all of the nervousness and apprehension about trust and trust in Facebook, if this thing is seamless, if it's a good product, globally people will use it. And that historically, from what I've seen, for all of the gripes and complaints about Facebook products, they're good and they work. And so people use it because it works.
And just tell us inside Facebook, how does the process work of developing something like this? And the reason I ask that is, I think almost everyone would agree that the Facebook products work brilliantly for consumers. The question is, what's the aggregate impact for society? So when you're thinking about the development of something that is disruptive, how do you think about the politics and regulation of that?
Yes, absolutely. So I was there in the early days. So I'm trying to, I'll try to frame how it would work now. You know, companies like Facebook are an engineer's empire, essentially. And so, you know, the ideas for the products will develop from understanding how are people misusing global services to make them work for them. So product development essentially comes, you know, the other way around. This is how Facebook's photo app was developed in the first place. You know, Facebook wasn't meant to be a photo sharing platform. People started changing their profile pictures all the time, and the company realized, wait, people are misusing this profile picture space to share photos. Maybe people want to share the photos. So initially, this would come probably from the world of engineering and consumer behavior.
And would just out of interest, would it come from the world, because I'm interested in that, do you think it comes from like engineers, or do you think it comes from Mark?
In this particular case, it probably did not come from Mark. Mark doesn't have his background in finance.
Right.
So I would be really surprised if this was Mark one day waking up and saying, you know, what we should do is get into this space. I could be totally wrong.
Okay.
But I would imagine, and then what would happen, see, is essentially then your policy, you have a liaison team that works between the policy team and the engineering team. So those guys are the people that would kind of, you know, hear about what's latest. And their job is essentially then to, as best they can, create a framework for that product succeeding. But it's not really a question of saying, oh, if you think it's not a great policy idea, we don't do it. No, your job is to do as best you can to make it, you know, to make it work. There are very few occasions where the policy team has been able to cut, you know, an idea because they felt that it would be so harmful. But generally speaking, that's absolutely not how it works. You just do the best you can to, you know, to create a successful product launch.
Okay, that's very interesting. Can I just ask, Steph, will you just do me a favour? That we've got a lovely little slide just on the size of the Facebook universe, which that gives you a sense of the sort of scale of how many sort of initial users are potentially available to Facebook in terms of its aggregate community. I just thought I'd just start with 3 very quick questions for the room. How many people here have used a Facebook product, i.e. Facebook, WhatsApp, or Instagram in the last 24 hours? All right. Can I just ask, how many people here are fearful of Libra? Concerned with Libra? Okay. And how many people here suspect they'll use it if it comes into practice? Okay, so using my extremely sophisticated algorithm, I would say almost everyone has used some kind of product, 90% plus. You'd say actually less than half are fearful, fewer than half are fearful, but actually about half expect that they would use it. It's quite an interesting sort of starting point. Hugh, if I can, I'm going to turn to you. We've got today a bunch of people who've written a great deal on this subject, and so have done some thinking. Probably the nicest cover, I would suggest, is this jaunty number from the Bank of England that Hugh Van Steenis, working with Governor Mark Carney on the future of finance, has written. Hugh, can we just pick up on what Elizabeth just said? That very rarely will the policy team of Facebook stop something from happening, right? i.e., it is therefore up to policymakers and regulators, it seems to me, to make a decision on whether something is in the best public interest. So when a subject like this comes, how does the regulatory system, not least the Bank of England, think about it?
Thanks, James. So, look, I agree with Elizabeth that payments is ripe for disruption in parts. You know, we can make it cheaper, faster, better, and in particular, taking out the friction and fraud, I think is essential. So I think, big picture, one should be embrace, innovation. I think too, the way Facebook's worked here is kind of against the grain that the way not just Europeans but regulators work. And I'm just going to give you one stat. So if you take the white paper plus all the other, the complete bundle, there's 78 pages on technology, 10 on governance, 4 on economics, and not a single page on regulation. So, the challenge here is, it's how on earth do regulators even react? They go like, what do you want? What is it that you want? In fact,
So which white paper do you mean?
So the Libra white paper. So in the launch documents, there are 78 pages on technology, 0 on regulation. So what do they respond to? So it's like, I've got this whiteboard idea that I want to create this global financial system. I'm picking a mix, a bit of what Alipay is doing in China, with a little bit of Google Wallet, with a bit of Stripe, and a bit of, and global identity, which David rightly unearthed. And here it is. So it's very difficult for Europeans to relate to that. Oh, sorry, I apologise, regulators to relate to that, because there's nothing there. And then also, and what you particularly hear also with when David went to the Senate, he said, I'm going to get regulated by the Swiss. And then the Swiss put out a comment saying no one's ever got in touch with us. Yeah. So it's a kind of, literally, the Swiss regulator said, I haven't heard of these people. Yeah. So, or they haven't called me yet. So, I think, look, I'm with Elizabeth, that, I think it's interesting. I'm going to slight, you want to be provocative, I'm going to take the other side of Elizabeth's comment. Not so much why now. For me, there is an interesting question, why now, was why they're so late. Yes. So, Ant Financial, Alipay, has now got 700 million customers in China and has got stakes in pretty much a payment company in every Asian market, bar one at the moment. They tried to buy MoneyGram, the remittance company, over 2 years ago actually. In fact, they bought this year a remittance company in the UK. Facebook's behind Google, who's got Google Pay, they're behind Amazon. In fact, the interesting question is why they haven't actually tried to use their network to find payments. And I think that my last comment is, I think that what's interesting for both the tech firms, payment firms, but also for the regulators, is payments is the battleground between tech and finance now. Everyone wants to have a wallet because everyone wants to be the gateway into the mobile stroke platform economy. And to give you one stat, the prize can be huge. So Alipay plus WeChat Pay, so the two dominant Chinese firms, between the two of them represent over 90% of all mobile payments in China. So if these guys get it right,
it's enormous.
It's a huge prize.
Can I ask you one thing? If you look, I hope you've seen your notes. Those rather fine things. Tortoise notes, they're worth having a look at. And you'll see also that they are done in conjunction with our host here. Our newsroom is held in this building, Fora, and they're one of our partners. And so I want to say thank you to them because they've enabled us to do this. If you look at it on page, on the opening page, who will regulate Libra? And we make exactly this point, which is, Facebook says the Swiss will supervise. The Swiss say, "Could you give us a call?" Right? It's a sort of lovely quote. Actually, funny enough, when I was thinking about it, I went from thinking that that's quite funny in a dark way to actually being really cross, right? And firstly, I was cross with Facebook, right? But then I was actually really cross with the Swiss. I was like, no one, it's also not impossible for the regulators to pick up the phone to Facebook and say, you know what, we are going to oversee this, and we are going to make if you like, an extension to our current responsibilities and take on Facebook Libra. And I guess one of the questions I think that hangs over this is there a hesitancy amongst regulators of every stripe and every jurisdiction to weigh in on something, and they'd rather push it off? Would the Bank of England rather push it to Ofcom, would Ofcom rather push it to the FCA? I'll come to you in 1 second, sir.
So I don't really want to, I'm speaking in a personal capacity here today, but obviously payments is not regulated by the bank per se, it's done by FCA and whatever, so it would actually be for the FCA and PSR in the UK. So I think one is just how finance normally works. Normally you work and you turn up and say, here's my idea, here's how to regulate it, this is which jurisdiction will work. So to be fair to the regulators, it's not the way they normally work. You might be right that they could be a little bit more forward-leaning and saying what they would like, rather than what they would respond to. But the G7 under the French have just set up a committee to look at Libra. Right. So they are in their own way, trying to get ahead of this.
Right.
You may not like the way they get ahead of it, but that's a different matter.
Quickly,
Sebastian, yeah.
I would.
Sorry, Sebastian, would you just introduce yourself here?
So I'm Sebastian Mallaby. I'm a think tanker from New York, despite my accent. And I've written some books on finance, including a history of, a biography of Greenspan, which leads me into central banking, which leads me into how money works and how regulation works. And I mean, I think there's so many financial innovations, Hugh, where people have just gone ahead and done it. I'm thinking of the US especially, whether it's originating weird mortgages, for example. And then there was a tragedy, exactly as James suggests, that nobody knew who was supposed to be manning the stores. So the Fed didn't want to do it because it was complicated. And it's not just CDOs and subprime and all that. It goes back to Fannie and Freddie in the early 90s, the two big housing finance companies in the US, where there was basically a game of ping pong. Nobody wanted to regulate it because it was such a political hot potato. And I think that the attitude of the Swiss, oh wait, you have to call us, that's just not going to, I mean, as Elizabeth began by saying, Facebook is going to go ahead and try and do this. So you can't expect them to come to you, you've got to go to them. And I think there's a distinct possibility that that just won't happen.
And do you think, and I guess, Sebastian, my impression is that if you're a regulator, the very last thing you ever want to do is take on a responsibility for something you can't fix.
Exactly.
And so your institutional self-protection would encourage you to shy away from taking on something like Libra.
100%, yeah.
So do you think it's, in the current regulatory framework, it's going to slip between large cracks?
Yeah, I do. And I think we should just clarify one thing, which is that Libra is not sort of Facebook moving into finance just. It's supposed to be a platform on which this distributed network of up to 100 companies will start to issue banking services and payment services. And so it's not just like you have to go talk to Facebook. You've got to be watching out for all of this. And it's a range of companies from Stripe. Yeah. So
No, Sebastian, finish. Richard, hold 1 second. I'm just going to ask this gentleman here. But so Sebastian.
So what I'm saying is that the regulatory challenge is bigger than just Facebook. You've got a distributed network of companies that are supposed to be getting involved. And so that's a very complex. And each one will be different. Trying to regulate Uber's relationship with Libra will be a fundamentally different task to regulating Stripe's relationship with Libra. It's a different kind of company. They'll come at it in a different way.
So, yes.
Hello, I'm Stephen from BCG. Just a couple of nuances just to put it out there. So there's a reason why there's a reason probably why Facebook set up Libra in Switzerland, which is basically because it has a regulatory framework which is friendly towards ICO-style startups, right? So first of all, when I say a Swiss regulator, there's as many regulators as industries and bodies. So it fits where it should fit, right? It's an NGO predicated on at some point issuing a token. Therefore, actually, it's kind of the right place to be, right? And it's the most stable place to be compared against Malta, Gibraltar, and other places. So that's one.
The safest and the cheapest.
It is the one that makes more sense
from the Facebook point of view.
From any company wants to issue ICO point of view, typically you go there.
ICO being
initial coin offerings. If you want, that's
cryptocurrency.
That's where
the people's not a cryptocurrency.
Yes, we'll come back in another time.
That's just one small clarification around kind of the why probably the second clarification is that from a regulatory perspective, maybe something to consider, maybe in this conversation is where does it will hit the road. A lot of the regulation challenges are not necessarily how the thing will be governed over and above supranational aspects of security, customer protection, all that, but actually how will this coexist locally in exchanges and affecting the monetary policy balance, especially because the mandate of Libra is not necessarily going to affluent demographic space. It's actually going to the unbanked space where actually the relative power is a different game. It's not like this room. And secondly, the inflation challenges are actually much more practical than here. So if you have, for example, I was brought up in Argentina, so the currency falls apart every 10 years. So if you're in a place where you have that situation and you have alternative currencies or alternative value transfers, you have a big problem as a regulator because you lose control of the flow.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And in a country where you have, in countries where you don't have stable regulatory environments, having someone like Facebook with a platform coming there, mindful that it's the only entry point, a lot of the Facebook Lite smartphone is the only entry point for internet, also then becoming 100% share of wallet for digital payments, it's a regulatory problem locally.
Yes, I think. Sorry, Matt, I want to cut you off. You were just make a point.
Oh, no, sorry, I was just going to say.
Can you say your name?
My name is Desiree Marcy, I'm with Global Counsel. Libra is not a cryptocurrency, it is a payments company that is using cryptocurrency rails. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, very well. I'll probably come back to you in a second. Which you would have said.
Yeah, I was just going to come back in the spirit of getting a bit of debate going. I think there's actually almost zero chance of this being underregulated.
Underregulated?
Yeah, zero chance. And I'll say zero, just I'll nail my cards to the mast. And the reasons for that are that if it's successful, it's either going to be collecting deposits or it's going to be making payments. And lending. So it's either going to be doing fractional reserve banking, payments, or
what's fractional reserve banking?
So taking in people's money
yes.
and then lending it out with a non-fully backed, not fully backing the loans with what you're holding in reserves. Right. So the standard banking system that we have. And that's the one that creates credit risk. So you're either creating risk due to the payment system or the deposit system or credit risk. Right. And so the FDIC, the Bank of England, have a duty to look at these people. If you add into that, so that you could debate whether that will be overregulated. If you add into that the fact that we've got a system of financial regulators, one of whom I worked during the financial crisis, the Bank of England, who are still stung by their performance, point one. And the second point, outside of finance, a general feeling that kind of these tech companies are getting a bit out of control and are tied against them. If you add all those facts together, I think there's pretty much zero chance of underregulation, of underregulation, and probably there will be overregulation. And final point, I've just got back from a big trip all around the world as part of a book I've been writing. And essentially it's about people living in the most extreme situations in the world, situations of extreme duress. Countries that have failed, notably the Democratic Republic of Congo, places that have been hit by a natural disaster, refugee camps. The point is, I didn't know this when I started out, but actually a major theme ended up being currencies. And in each one of these odd and marginal places, I found that people were using some weird, organic, self-invented thing as a currency. So US prisons have their own special hidden currencies. Refugee camps have their own special hidden currencies. In Kinshasa, they use informally the dollar and the Congolese franc because their currencies won't work. Anyway, the point is that the global currency system doesn't work for these people. So Facebook, like Facebook or loathe them, I think they are onto something.
Right, yeah.
The very fact that people in extreme duress having to invent currencies which can be, pouches of tobacco, tins of mackerel, anything to allow them to exchange, that tells you there's a gap in our currency system, and these guys or somebody else might fill it.
So, Francis, we'll come to you in 1 second, but we are quite lucky to have David here. So many of you who follow this area will know David Birch's writing. If you don't, he has a great book, Before Babylon, Beyond Bitcoin, which has a sort of wonderful subtext, from money that we understand to money that understands us. I'm not sure I feel warmer at that thought, David. But can you do us, we probably should have actually started here, which is, is it Desna, did you say your name? Explain to us what you think Libra is.
Well, I think it's two things. So just I'm not a lawyer, but just on the regulatory point, if you did it in the UK, I don't think it would be a regulatory problem. I think what Libra does is... What is this?
It's like the BBC. You can never...
Oh. Because as constitute, it would be... it would be regulated as electronic money under an existing electronic money license, which, as far as I can see, it qualifies.
So hold on, slow down.
So I don't
Can
see
you
it as
just
a regulatory problem.
Just explain to us first what it is, because I think I don't even
Sorry.
understand what it is.
Well, I think you have to have two things in your head. So there's Libra, the money. I reserve judgment on whether it's a cryptocurrency or not for a second. There's Libra, the money, and there's Calibra, the wallet. And personally, I'm sceptical as to whether Libra, the currency, will ever make it to the starting line. Not because there's.
Can you just explain something? Just because we're just going. Sorry to interrupt.
No.
So the difference between a cryptocurrency and Libra, what's the dispute?
Well,
there
remember,
about?
I'm a horrible nerd about these sort of things. So a cryptocurrency has its value determined entirely by the market, by cryptography.
Yes.
Essentially. So Bitcoin is a cryptocurrency. Nobody establishes the value of a Bitcoin. Its value is maintained only because of the mathematics. If the mathematics fails, the value goes to zero.
And
the value of Libra is maintained by the Libra reserve. It's what, I hate to say this sitting next to an economist, but I would probably call it a currency board rather
It is
than
a currency board.
Yeah, a currency
Currency
board.
Does everyone?
Because its reserve is 100% in other currencies.
Okay, so currency. Desmond, I'm just going to come back to you on this.
Sorry, I was just going to say, just Hugh's point on the G7 going to have oversight of Libra, and also Christopher Woolard at the FCA said Libra, the currency, falls more within the stable coin, so it could actually be a derivative or a basket of other assets.
Right. So do we all sort of broadly agree with that definition, Richard?
I'll do a very, very quick definitional double-hander.
Yes.
So most currencies are based on some sort of faith, and the fiat, we call them fiat currencies, which basically a Bank of England note, it says, I will pay the bearer £10. All that they will pay you is another £10 note. And it's backed by the government's promise that that is acceptable within taxation. It is no longer, and sometimes people are a bit shocked when you tell them this, it's no longer exchangeable for a load of gold that's stored in the Bank of England vault. So that's a fiat currency. And essentially you could say that Bitcoin's a bit like that. It's not backed by anything. A currency board is where you have your own currency, historically been used by emerging markets that people were a bit worried they might be unsustainable. So they issue their own currency because they want their own currency for their own domestic reasons. But they back it, i.e. they hold 100%, and normally a mix, dollars, euros, yen, and so on behind it. So therefore, the currency is circulating in their own name. It could be James Harding's currency, but behind it is a kind of brick wall of other countries' currencies, and that's what these guys are proposing.
So can I just understand something?
Is that right?
Sorry, forgive me. Can I just ask a very simple thing? So if there's £100 million worth of Libra, does the Libra reserve have to have £100 million?
Yes. Although the interesting thing is, could they break that peg in the future?
Exactly.
That's the really, and then so it could in the future potentially be torn apart. Can I give you a slightly different definition?
Yes.
So the way I try to explain it in a silly way is like, the Voltaire's gag that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Yes. So Libra is not a cryptocurrency because it's not permissionless, it's not decentralised, and as these guys have said, it's not really a currency.
Right. Okay. Francis.
It's a token, and we tend to use the term cryptocurrency really rather loosely to mean anything that's a token. I would rather call it a token because I think it's more accurate than calling it a cryptocurrency.
So Avios.
Which, as Dave said, has a specific meaning. But if we're not careful, we do get into kind of sort of one true Scotsman. So in a way, let's park that there and say, okay, it kind of falls into the general remit of things that people like to call cryptocurrencies and I'd rather call tokens.
Sorry, the reason why I think it's important for us, because people like me don't really understand, and I'll come to you in 1 second. So let's just assume, so it's not cryptocurrency, we'll call it a stable coin, is that a reasonable term of art? A stable coin which is backed then by a reserve. Right? Can you just explain for us, David, if you might, I don't understand what happens if you've got 2 billion customers, right, who then say, actually, we're each going to, have 20 billion, 10 pounds each worth of exchange, let's say, and there's suddenly 20 billion pounds, let's say, in that system. Right. How do they?
This system already exists. Go down to Kenya and have a look at M-Pesa. Right, this system already exists. You walk into a phone shop in Kenya, and you hand over Kenyan shillings, and in return they give you electronic Kenyan shillings. Right, so let's call them Libra because it's exactly the same thing. Right. Where do those shillings go? Well, they go into the commercial bank of Kenya. You know, Facebook isn't allowed to have that money and just go put it on the horses like banks do. Under an electronic money license, they have to hold it as Tier 1 capital.
So hold on, can you just explain that? So once I put my money in, I'm one of the 2 billion, I put my £10 in, right? There's now 20 billion sitting in the Libra reserve, right? What are the rules governing where that money can and can't go?
Well, I don't know what the rules are under the Swiss, but if that was...
It is specified in the paper, so two things are specified.
No, it says in the paper they'll hold it as other in the paper it says essentially Tier 1 capital. So in the UK they would have to do that. I don't know what the rules are in Switzerland.
But just to be clear, what they need to hold is a liquidity buffer. They don't need to hold the whole money. They need to hold enough, and this is what is going to be interesting.
So a liquidity buffer, I assume, means...
So let's take the example of M-Pesa. You need only enough money to prevent a run on the M-Pesa.
Right, okay, fine.
Okay, but that's not how it works. It's 100%.
The challenge with Libra is that how are you going to do that in multiple jurisdictions at the same time?
Okay.
It's a 100% reserve. You can't have a run on it.
Okay.
So if everybody goes and cashes in a Libra and gets pounds back for it, that's fine. It doesn't matter.
Okay.
So
All right.
It's not the interesting part of the proposition.
Oh, look, can I just try to bring some order? I'm going to come to you, Francis, and come to you, Madam, and then you, sir. Francis.
Okay, I think this is an important point because I've read the Libra white paper and it is very clear, I think, that what they are planning to hold is not 100% of a basket of currencies, which, as Dave pointed out, I think would have to be held in bank accounts somewhere. And they're not. They're going to hold a collection of assets, which may or may not include actual physical actual currencies, but are likely to involve all sorts of other things. You said Tier 1 capital. There is no particular reason, given they've self-defined this, unless they are regulated by somebody who says, thou shalt make it Tier 1 capital, and you will have to produce audits to prove it. There's no particular reason why they should necessarily do what they say. We have recent... can I just step back a bit quickly and say, I don't think this is even slightly innovative. It's not. It is far. We have seen examples of this going on all the time, which are far ahead of this. This is Facebook jumping on a bandwagon.
Late.
And very late to the party. And the only advantage it has is a very large existing customer base. But I have yet to see any particular reason why its very large existing customer base should necessarily use it, because they have alternatives which frankly are as good, if not better. To give you an example, in the Facebook white paper it says, at some time, we wish to make it possible for people to pay bills with the push of a button, buy a coffee with the swipe of a card, and ride the metro without carrying a metro card. Now, as it happens, I've done all three of those this morning. Because I parked my car in a local authority car park and paid for it with an app on my phone. Okay, the train is primitive, I had to buy a ticket. Oh dear. Well, when I got to London, I rode the metro using a contactless card, the tube using a contactless card, and I can buy a coffee in Costa round the corner using a contactless card. I don't need this thing.
Right, okay, I would come to you, Madam, I'll come back to you. So will you just introduce yourself?
I'm Catherine McBride from the IEA, and I could talk about the banking business, but I would like to just add that I think Facebook's, I'm guessing, are coming late to the party because they actually came late to the party with Facebook as well. That technology was already there, but they were able to see how other people failed and what needed to be fixed because they want to become the brand leader or the market leader, I'm guessing. I don't know, you would know more of this. And the best way to do that is to let everyone else have a go, pick out the best bits of what everyone else is doing and put it into one pile.
I think that's...
Hold on you 1 second.
But they will have massive problems on the banking system in terms of they will hold it in assets, as you say, and with a basket of currencies, if one of those currencies falls or if the assets that they're buying go down, it will be quite tricky to top that up. So I think that it won't be audited because it'll be a bit like a new American Express, if you like, which was the first global payment system and is hundreds of years old. Or actually Western Union was the first one. And it'll allow you to move it around the world, but the money is in the West. You know, it's nice to think that they'll be down in Africa and in South America helping the poor people, but there's no money there, you know. They're actually moving money around the world with money.
So, Captain Clegg, I'm going to come to you, sir. Yes.
I was just going to say...
Will you just introduce yourself? Will you just introduce yourself?
Bruce, I first went through the door as a regulator in various innovations, and though they don't intervene, you have to go to them. It's a game of bluff where you have to guess the regulation. That is how they work. They don't bring you up. The whole game is you need to know the regulation. The regulator tests your knowledge, not the other way around. The regulators don't tell you what to do, because then you can sue them when they get it wrong. So it's you that gets sued when you get it wrong. That's the whole game that you play with regulation. And you know, with SOPA we weren't allowed to be regulated, and with Abundance I was supposed to be. I was regulated. So both those experiences are pretty negative. But I think the key thing here is whether or not this is a Bristol pound, okay, which is 100% backed by pounds,
yes,
is issued as a token and therefore not money, and therefore not regulated by the Bank of England. You don't go to jail, or is it something that's backed by things that can move in value, in which case it probably should be regulated by the Bank of England and people should go to jail. Right. So this is because people are taking risks with that they don't understand. The key thing here is, if I go to Facebook and I sign up for this currency, did I just understand that conversation you had? No. Therefore, is this suitable for people to use, which is the key test here? Is this an understandable risk? Now, if it's a currency that is 100% backed by things of the same value, there's probably no risk, therefore maybe we should look at that on a proportionate basis in terms of how it's regulated. Or is there significant risk of loss or detriment from me getting into this because I didn't understand? Facebook didn't put up sufficient risk warnings to tell me that I was buying into something that has a variable value and therefore might not be worth what I put in.
And Bruce, sorry, just answer your question. Which is it?
Which is it? Well, it sounds like it is the latter, which is something that could go to jail for.
Okay.
If it's got a variable, if it's an ETF and it has a variable basket of currencies.
Sir, you're going to make...
Yeah, just gonna,
could you say your point? Let's say
Daniel Safko from Design Technology. We deal with making tax forms easy, so FATCA and CRS, two international tax regulations that basically meant to trace where wealth exists. I think one of the themes that has sort of emerged here is that in emerging markets, that's perhaps where there's a sweet spot here for Libra, in terms of both mobile usage and where there's a regulatory need. And just as a hypothesis, as to whether or not, because this represents a potentially better means of exchange of wealth in lower income countries, as to whether or not that's actually the way in which Facebook wants to get around sort of. They've not gone for regulation. They haven't really stated that they want to be regulated in any major economy. Switzerland perhaps accepted that it has an environment which is politically stable, and they're not worried about something taking over the Swiss franc on a global basis. But actually, from a pure sort of national supervision perspective, if we assume tech is the death of incompetent governance, actually there's an exchange here, right? They can make a quid pro quo with, let's say, Argentina, which cannot necessarily manage its currency properly, and therefore cannot necessarily trace where wealth has gone properly. So that's a hypothesis.
Okay, so there's a general point, and I'll come to you, Desno. Yes, sir.
Hey, Brett Scott, Independent. I want to throw out something a bit controversial. I mean, it kind of relates to this. I often like to sense in the language around Libra, there's this underlying neo-imperialism, essentially. This idea that somehow some group of tech bros, essentially gigantic $1 billion companies based out of California, are somehow in a better position to manage the world's currency than others. And Desna and I from South Africa, my family's from Zimbabwe. I often hear the language coming out of California and how people speak about these countries. I'm going to go as far as to say it's actually underlying racism in a lot of the language. It's implicit. It's this underlying belief that actually what is needed here is some external incursion to come in and to sort of take over these situations. Any real development economist knows you do not help people by making external dependence. You build internal resilience in your countries. You build your own monetary systems. You build these things. Francis knows this. I mean, this is like the most crucial thing. It's so shallow how the language around this is operating in the public domain right now.
Interesting, Desmond.
I actually was going to make a similar point to Brett, also piggybacking on the lady in the front's point that there's no money in digital assets in emerging markets. And M-Pesa was the world leader in digital assets. Digital assets were invented in Africa. Half of Kenya's GDP passes through M-Pesa. That is a stunning amount of money. $100 billion passes through payments platform Azimo on a, can I finish please? On a yearly basis through Africa. So there's a lot of money and a lot of potential in emerging markets, especially in Africa. And Africa is a norms maker, not a norms taker.
Yeah, no, and I would actually say to the man at the back, M-Pesa's been a great way of pooling capital.
Yeah.
And the real reason that Africa can't develop is that too much capital comes in from outside, and they need to pool their own capital to develop their own resources, which they have enormous amounts of resources. And for that area, it would be fantastic, but that is not going to be from a Facebook currency. That needs to be an African currency if you like to pool capital.
I'm going to come to you, sir, in one moment. I was just going to say, if you think about it, we're sort of beginning to get the framework of an understanding of what Libra is, some of the questions about the institutional instincts of regulators, but we are just only now beginning to touch on some of the issues that they'll cover. So I know we haven't yet dealt really with data and privacy questions. We touched, thanks to Argentina, a little bit on systemic risks in different areas. I also think we haven't really talked about consumer benefits and what those might be in disruption of payment systems. So if anyone wants to weigh in on any of those, do. Sir.
Yes, I'm David Wood from London Futurists. I value the discussion on Libra, which I don't know so much about, but I'm learning. I do know more about Facebook, and much as I love it, I also fear it. I want to come back to Elizabeth's point in the beginning. She contrasted a let's go carefully approach with the California, let's go in and do it first and ask for permission later, which Mark Zuckerberg used to sum up as a move fast and break things, before he decided that wasn't such a good motto after all. Especially when things become so pervasive that the consequences of getting it wrong aren't something that can be easily fixed, because you've burnt down much, much bigger things. I read Zucked recently by Roger Mallaby, one of the initial advisors to Facebook, in which he recounted his changed thoughts about Facebook. He'd gone from admiring them to being very afraid that these was a big organisation that was taking on things beyond its ability and beyond its care. So much so I'm interested in Libra, and I can see that it can be used. I do worry that Facebook will do bad things to it, like, I don't know what, but it might say, well, you posted bad things on Facebook, you're deprived from access to your accounts. And of course they say they won't, but can we really trust them that they really won't?
Can I ask you a question, Elizabeth, about that? Because I think, I think everyone in the room will understand your point about, if you're an innovator, you get on it. But I think that David's point is something that lots of people share, which is, does Facebook not get it? Does Facebook not get the fact that for hundreds of millions, arguably billions of people, the tide of public opinion has turned against them, and the idea of now handing over money as well as all of our information, photos, data, feels terrifying.
So something that I would, first of all, really interesting that you have Nick Clegg now getting his. I was just out catching up with Elliot Schrage, who's the former Nick Clegg role.
Yeah.
And Nick Clegg is kind of getting his sea legs now at the company, and so interesting changes will be taking place as he makes whatever impact he's going to have. I think one of the biggest mistakes that I see in London commentary on decisions Facebook makes is we see journalists and we see politicians look through a fiercely London lens. That's not how the company is making decisions.
Yeah.
They're making decisions based off their more than 2 billion user base of Facebook alone, and then you add in all the people who are using WhatsApp or Instagram but don't have Facebook accounts, and I don't have those figures. But that more than 2 billion people, so people in a hyper-connected, really well-run city like London, and I'm so appreciative of this atmosphere that we have, and all over Europe, but that's tiny. I mean, in comparison to the rest of the user base. So these decisions, and I spent a lot of time in Kinshasa as a Facebook representative, these decisions are based off really, really big numbers and majority of what they see needs to be done. The same I used to see in the political space. You know, when everything was starting to come out about the elections, you know, in 2016 here and in 2016 in the States, there was this huge call, you know, from places like London to say, well, let's make sure that you increase transparency on where it is that every single political ad comes from. I get that if you live in the UK because you can speak freely. But in the countries I used to spend time in, you know, the biggest advantage of Facebook is that you could have a point of view and be protected by the ability not necessarily to be traced, because you would be arrested or in jail for holding that opinion. So just bear in mind as we're hashing this out, how decisions are made. They're not made based off of the small percentage of people who live in London.
So I'm going to come to Katie, my co-founder, and I'm going to come to you, Sebastian, and to you, Francis.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fascinating, and I would just say I didn't really understand Libra until this conversation, so thank you for explaining it. But actually, I don't think the price of Libra, I go back to your point, there will be regulation around where money is controlled, where money is the conversation. My issue is with Calibra, the wallet, right? And what is it that people and consumers are giving the control of and the power to? So I think, yes, the money part of it is fascinating, interesting. But actually, the issue with Facebook, again, is the data question, right? And actually, people not understanding where the power is in what they're building. So they're building a platform, yes, 100 plus distributed. They'll set the rules of that platform, like they did for other things that they've disrupted, right? And so, yes, they have more control than we think, and they need to understand from regulators what they should be setting on their platform. But I worry about the end consumer and the wallet and the data, not the financial transactions, but what, again, we're giving as consumers to Facebook in a way that we don't understand as end users.
Sebastian, come to you one second, but Dave, I'll cut you off when you were about to say what you were thinking about Calibra. So,
well, I was going to say, I was going to make 2 points about it. So first of all, and Hugh and I think we'll probably agree on this, I think Calibra is a much bigger and much more interesting play than Libra. The people in the countries that you're talking about,
can everyone hear David? Yeah.
Sorry, the people in the countries that you're talking about, who to them the internet is Facebook. Mm-hmm. So having a wallet where they could store these currencies, it's just, even then they wouldn't store Congolese payments, they'd still store US dollars. Mm. But the point is, that would be a much bigger play. And in terms of, you know, public benefits or whatever, having the ability to send money to anybody else who's on Facebook is a big deal. Absolutely. I mean, that actually would be, for a great many people, fantastic, right? So I agree completely. You've got to distinguish the Libra mucking about with cryptocurrency, whoever, whatever, you know, maybe, maybe not. Yeah. I would, you know, you had the IMF a couple of days ago putting out this thing about the ESDR, and I would rather hold an ESDR than Libra, whatever.
So what's the ESDR?
Special drawing right.
Oh, SDR, sorry, okay, yeah.
So what you're going to put in your Calibra wallet, whether it's Libra or anything else, is one question. But I agree with Katie. The control of the wallet is a much more interesting proposition. And what you'll probably have observed from the quiz, it's interesting that the currency is, oh, we're all pals, we'll have lots of people in the network, and we'll be in Switzerland and whatever. The wallet is a Facebook subsidiary.
Absolutely.
End of story.
Right, interesting. Sebastian.
So you invited us a minute ago to think about what regulators should focus on. And somebody invoked Roger McNamee, one of the critics. Another one now is Chris Hughes, who was, of course, a co-founder and is now quite public about being worried about Facebook and calling it this breakup. And I know him a little bit. We had an email exchange when he wrote a piece in the FT about the regulatory risks. And what I left that exchange feeling is that, you know, you can, for regulators, there's a concern people raise about monetary policy. Is this going to create more money in circulation? And I think if it's a 100% backed currency board, that won't happen. And even if in the future it deviates from a 100% backed currency board so that it's a fractional reserve system, central banks have offset fractional reserve banking forever. That's what they do for a living. And so the central bank can create monetary stability even if the Libra evolved towards being not 100% backed. So I don't think monetary policy is a new challenge or a worry. There's a capital controls issue, which is that now you can move money in and out of a currency much more easily, and that could destabilize exchange rates. My view on that is that there are countries that operate capital controls at the moment, and to do that you have to be quite a sophisticated state. It's a difficult thing to enforce. And the states that are sophisticated enough to do that in the pre-Libra world will probably be good enough to do it in the post-Libra world. That you can threaten the companies that are operating Libra with regulatory retaliation if they don't impose capital controls on their platform. We've seen tons of examples in the history of digital evolution where somebody says, oh, now we've got the internet, everything can happen offshore, there can be a sea station, a sea platform, where we'll put servers, and now we can have something that's illegal, like you can't gamble in certain ways in the US, but we'll put it on offshore, and then hey presto, we'll get around US regulation. It's always rubbish, that kind of argument, because the people who use the offshore platforms are human beings located in the US, and you go and arrest them.
But can I just understand two things on that, Sebastian? Just your first point on monetary policy, right? If you were taking Stephen's point, is it Stephen? Sorry. If we were in Argentina and we were fearful that Libra would grow to such a scale, would you still be confident that your monetary policy lever, as much as you have one, would not be impacted by the rise of something like Libra?
The thing to understand is that private banks are creating money all the time. They're taking in a deposit and then they are lending out more than they took in. That's fractional reserve banking. So they're creating purchasing power.
Yeah.
And Libra might create purchasing power if it operated in this fractional reserve fashion. But the job of the central bank is to tighten monetary policy to offset that inflationary impetus. Now, central banks sometimes mess that up. In Argentina, it frequently messes it up. But that's not a new thing.
Right.
So I think,
Actually, I would argue the other way around. I think, so at the moment, the capital flight from Argentina, the money goes in suitcases full of $100 bills and nobody knows where it goes. If it was going through Calibra wallets, that would actually make it easier to trace the money, not harder.
Yeah, right. So that's...
All right. Okay, hold on. We've got a few different points and we're running out of time. I said I'd come back to you, Francis, then I'll come to Hugh, then Richard, then Tess.
I want to throw out a few things because this kind of sort of, oh, you're a London-based person who doesn't understand the rest of the world is actually, it's actually a bit unfair, I think. So I thought I'd throw out a couple of things. First of all, M-Pace has already been mentioned, really important. But it's not the only initiative. Recently, just in the last few days, I've been looking at the rise of e-money across the whole of Asia, and it is huge. It is huge. Facebook is way behind the curve in Asia, and I mean the whole of Asia. China, obviously, with Alipay and WeChat, but also the rest of it as well. So it's absolutely enormous, and it's being pushed by governments there, actually. And I think we underestimate the extent to which the power of government to actually promote the use of a particular currency and to empower its adoption among their citizens. You underestimate that. And my other point that I would wish to make is this, that because this absolutely flew under the radar and I think people need to know about it. 2 days after the announcement of Libra, SWIFT, which is notably absent from the Facebook conglomerate, along with every major bank, announced its own initiative to revolutionise international payments, using existing technology and its existing very large banking base. It currently handles 55, the GPI initiative it rolled out 2 years ago already handles 55% of international payments, and it's basically saying that by 2020 it will handle pretty much all of them. So I'm just wondering what exactly Facebook thinks it's disintermediating.
Interesting. The views in the... Rich, I'm going to come to you. Yeah. Now.
Sorry. I'll be very quick. All of this, definitely right. But to Elizabeth's starting point, there is a risk of thinking in your old, non-disruptive ways, and there's a risk of that about regulation. So I'll throw one out there. Are we seeing the first truly social currency? And if we are, is there a new risk of a massive Ponzi scheme Sounds a bit out there, but if anyone's seen, for example, the documentary on Herbalife, I'm not saying that is a Ponzi scheme or isn't a Ponzi scheme, but there are just legal reasons. But there have been Ponzi schemes in history. One took down the entire, I think it was Latvia, an entire Baltic economy. It got so big, and basically the end point with scams that involve some selling to your contacts and friends ends up being the size of your network, and they stop because the pyramid schemes become so big that the next level becomes so big and you can't reach them. Actually, this would facilitate those kind of scams on a huge scale, and if you look into it, there is a slightly bubbling literature that these Ponzi schemes, get your friends to pay, you'll pay them back, have been made easier by social networks. They particularly affect women because women have more friends on Facebook, and they particularly affect religious groups because people in religious groups have more trust and have more friends on Facebook. So if you added into that a new currency, could you have a sort of huge Ponzi scheme? And I just raised that because it's exactly the sort of thing a regulator, I used to be a regulator, won't be looking for. They'll be looking at capital and fractional reserve banking and all that stuff.
Yes. Tess, you want to say?
Tiny point. My concern is the monopolisation of the remittance market and what that does at the lowest end, where there's a real need for very cheap transfer of small amounts of money through the diaspora, you name it. If we end up with a monopolistic tech access model for that really concerns me.
Can I just make one very quick point on remittances? The reason why remittances are expensive has got nothing to do with current, like sending money from here to Timbuktu costs the same as sending money from here to Cirencester. It's not because electrons get more expensive when remittances are expensive because of identity. It's KYC, AML, CTF, PEP, and Libra won't make any difference to those kinds. Calibra, the wallet, will have to have exactly the same KYC, AML, everything. So I'm sceptical about the price of remittances.
Remittances are expensive because of the guarantee.
Can I just make a small point? The tyranny that we live under is this little Tortoise Agatha, and I'm afraid she's come to her end. So I'm going to try and wrap it up so people can get away. And Catherine too, if you don't mind. I'm going to wrap it up, but please stick around because there's a lot to discuss and lots of people, as you can tell in this room, know a great deal about it. I'm going to wrap it up in the way in which we would, if I might, at in an editorial conference. At the end of it, what you try to do is not necessarily have a summary, but I hope a point of view. Ours is massively better informed by the conversation today. I'm enormously grateful to everyone for coming. I think that we'll come away thinking, I suppose, four things very simply in this order. The first is, I think I really embrace, Elizabeth, the sort of spirit that you kicked off with, which is, innovation is something that exciting, and we shouldn't think that innovation is going to follow a political timetable. It's going to follow the timetable of what innovators can do. And in the seeds of what you said, I think is essentially the struggle we're dealing with, which is that innovators operate without regard for policy. I thought the thing that you said that was most interesting in some ways today was that that almost never has Facebook stopped doing something because someone in the policy unit said, well, let's not do that. So that, I think, raises three really big questions that flow from that. The first is, I think, the point that Brett and Desney were making, and Francis as well, which is we are talking about things that are rooted in California but have global consequences, but without any real address of what that means in communities and countries themselves. And I do think that this assumption that technology can operate on a global level without any meaningful containment at the national level is a real and serious problem. And if anything, the point that Stephen was making, which is, yes, they've elected to use a regulator in the most secretive banking society we've developed in the Western world, namely Switzerland, I think should give us some serious cause for alarm. So I think that neo-imperialism point, the language is very strong, but the point is extremely well made, and I think that's something to think about. So the globalization element is really strong. I think that I was really struck, I came into this much more concerned about monetary policy distortions, systemic distortions, disruptions of banking systems, and what Libra would do. The explanation of what Libra is as regards to a stable coin, a reserve board, was actually really helpful, made me largely less concerned. but much more concerned about the data and the Libra point. So coming away having really appreciated the extension to which this is a new tier of ownership of data and what that will mean for Facebook is, I think, deeply, deeply alarming. And I think that gets to the third point and the final point for us, which would be, what should we be arguing for? I appreciate the point, I guess, that Richard and Sebastian were making, which is that there is a great deal of this which is, if you like, already exists in the system. I think, everyone was making this point that, in some way or another, this is not Facebook, quote-unquote, innovating, it's Facebook catching up. That said, when you make changes at this scale, the consequences of it are not necessarily the same as marginal changes before. And so my concern, I think, is along the lines that sort of Sebastian articulated, and Hugh made the similar point, which is the risk is that the innovator is innovating, and the regulators will only act after the fact. And if you look at the Fannie and Freddie example, if you look at the example of new financial instruments, it's always been after the fact. It seems to me as though the risk is that the institutional interests of regulators is not to make a land grab in this context, but that's what we certainly need. And so there needs to be some argument for a new architecture of regulation and oversight in the technology and financial space. And at the moment, that doesn't exist. And so I suppose the natural argument for us would be, nationally and internationally, trying to think through what that regulatory and oversight system would be. That would be where Tortoise would come out, having heard this conversation. I appreciate that is a beginner's answer to a complicated question. I just wanted to finish up by saying, as you can see on a subject like this, we are trying to get to grips with the ways in which data and artificial intelligence are transforming the fundamental elements of our society. My colleague Alexandra Mousavizadeh and I are trying to think about how we develop an AI index that looks at disruption and preparedness. If you've got thoughts for us on how we do that, we'd both really appreciate it. I'd also like to say, please do stick around if you want to talk about this particular issue. As you can see, we've got a great number of people who really know what they're talking about. I'd like to do a plug, not for David's book, because I've done that, but also for Richard's Extreme Economies. Do read it, it looks brilliant, and it's out at the beginning of September. And finally, if you want to join us for a private think-in on what we do and say about Boris Johnson's government, we're going to do that in the green room next door. But for now, thank you to our expert voices. Thank you to you for coming. Have a great day.